Alright, so this class is a class in ethics or moral philosophy, so, philosophy is to a large degree about evaluating arguments, about making arguments, but we're going to focus on moral arguments. So how do we evaluate moral arguments? How do we figure out if they're good ones? How do we make good moral arguments? Well, the first thing to do is to break them down into their parts. And a moral argument will always involve moral statements. We'll see that a moral argument always has among its premises at least one moral statement, and the conclusion is always a moral statement, right? So what does a moral statement look like? As Vaughan says, moral statements make claims about an action being right or wrong, or a person's character being good or bad. But I think a better way to put this, or maybe another way that's helpful for me, if it's not helpful for you, you don't have to use it, but this is helpful for me, is to think of a moral statement as being, in some way based on an ought or a should. It can be traced back to an ought or a should claim, even if that's not there explicitly in the statement. So here's some moral claims. Seeking revenge is wrong. Right? But, you can think of this, there's an ought claim buried under this. People ought not or should not seek revenge. You shouldn't enable other people's bad behavior, right? The should is right there. We should respect other people's opinions if we disagree. President shouldn't forgive student loan debt. Healthcare is a fundamental human right, right? Now look, both of these are political statements, but a lot of what goes on in politics are moral claims, right? What we as a society should do. Right? And when we say healthcare is a fundamental human right, we mean something like, well, society should provide healthcare for people, right? Or people shouldn't be denied healthcare. Everybody should have healthcare, right? So even though this is stated as an is claim, there's a sort of should claim behind it, right? Brian is a very petty person. Fred is too nice, right? But again, there are should or ought claims here, right? Brian might be vindictive, right? He might hold grudges. He might go out of his way to get even with people who've, irritated him. That's what we mean by calling somebody petty, right? People shouldn't be that way. When we call somebody petty, it's a term of disapproval. We're saying you're acting in ways you shouldn't, right? You say somebody's too nice. They should think more of themselves. They shouldn't be so giving, right? Non-moral statements. As Vaughan says, they don't say anything about right or wrong or good or bad. They simply say that something is true or is the case. A better way to pick them out, or at least another way to pick them out, might be to say, they come back to an is, but there's no ought or should involved, right? Arya wants revenge against the Lannisters, right? If you guys have seen Game of Thrones, she definitely does. That might be a good thing, that might be a bad thing. It's just a statement of fact. She wants revenge against the Lannisters. Brian Leiter, he's a guy with a blog. He's a law professor. He has repeatedly threatened to sue people for saying or writing things he doesn't like, right? If you annoy this guy, he will threaten to sue you. It's the thing he does. Right? Now look, I'm not saying if that's a good or a bad thing, you might guess how I feel about that. It's just a description of what this particular person does. He threatens to sue people when they say things he doesn't like, right? Biden is thinking about forgiving student debt. I mean, he is, right? The newspapers, unlike the statement here that says he shouldn't do it, all this does is report a fact. He's considering doing this thing. In the United Kingdom, the government provides citizens health care through the National Health Service. Right? That's true. That's a statement of fact. The British government does that. You might think that's wonderful. You might think the U.S. should do that. You might think that's terrible, that the government's overstepping its bounds. Doesn't matter. This isn't saying anything about that. It's just saying this is what the government does. Doesn't say it should do it, doesn't say it shouldn't. Just reporting a fact. Fred Rogers, the children's show host, there's an urban myth that he was a Marine sniper. He was not. He was never a Marine sniper. That's just a statement of fact. You know, he actually was, well, a children's show host, and the other thing he trained for was being a Presbyterian minister. He was never in the Army, never in the Marines, never in the military, unsurprisingly. Alright, so hopefully you guys see the distinction between moral statements and moral and non-moral statements. So let's talk about moral arguments. Moral arguments have a moral statement as the conclusion, and in the premises they always have at least one moral statement and one non-moral statement. So here is an example. Administering a punishment to criminals that doesn't deter crime is immoral. The death penalty does not deter crime, so the death penalty is immoral, right? Think about this for a second, you know, count to 5 here and give you guys a chance to think about it. Which of premises 1 or 2 is the moral statement? Which one is the factual or non-moral statement? Oh, just incidentally, you could probably rewrite this to use an if-then statement. It's kind of implied. If a punishment doesn't deter crime, it's immoral. The death penalty doesn't deter crime. It's kind of what the statement's getting at, right? Moral premise, if a punishment doesn't deter crime, it's immoral. The death penalty does not deter crime, so the death penalty is immoral, right? Non-moral premise, the death penalty doesn't deter crime. Now look, I'm not saying that you should accept either of these statements. I just want you, maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't, I just want you to be able to pick out which is the moral premise, which is the non-moral premise. Here's one about student loan debt. The government should not forgive the debts of relatively wealthy people. Moral statement. Non-moral, people with student loan debt are relatively wealthy. Therefore, the government shouldn't forgive the debts of people with student loan debt. Look, not saying the premises are right or wrong, not saying the conclusions are right or wrong, just an example, want you to be able to pick out moral and non-moral premises. So why do we talk about this? And why is it important to spot the moral premises and sort them out from the non-moral premises? Well, it's important because this distinction is important to how we judge premises in the argument, or how we come up with good premises ourselves. How we judge non-moral principles, how we decide if they're true or not, how we come up with good ones ourselves, is going to be different than how we judge or come up with good moral principles. So, wanted to introduce the distinction this lecture. In the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit about how to judge non-moral principles and a little bit about how to judge non-moral ones. We will keep hitting on the issue of how to judge moral premises throughout the class, right? That's what we're doing in this class. It's a class in moral philosophy. The non-moral premises one we'll talk about a bit. It won't be, it's super important, right? But it's just not what we're going to focus on in this class, because again, you can't do everything you might want to. You know, if you did, your classes would last 4 or 5 years. I don't have that much time. The school's not giving it to me, and you know, I'm gonna guess y'all don't have that much patience, right? So we will focus more, after next lecture where we talk about both, we will focus more on evaluating moral principles, or moral premises.